The wind, a restless spirit, clawed at the prairie, tasting of dust and distant snow. It found the solitary cabin, a weathered knuckle of wood clenched against the vast, unforgiving palm of the land, and whined at its eaves. Inside, Ilara moved with the economy of long practice, her silence a companion, not an enemy. The fire in the stone hearth was a living thing, a small, defiant heart beating against the encroaching chill of the late afternoon. She stirred the meager stew, the scrape of the wooden spoon against the iron pot a familiar rhythm in the quiet symphony of her existence. Her face, framed by hair the color of parched earth, was a map of unspoken sorrows, her eyes holding the deep, still waters of a grief long born. Years had passed since laughter echoed in this small space, since the warmth of another human presence was anything but a phantom limb, an ache for what was lost. The prairie had taken much, and given only solitude in return. She had learned to accept its harsh terms. A sound, not of the wind, nor of the small creatures that skittered in the dry grasses, pricked her attention. It was a faint cry, thin and reedy, almost stolen by the keening gale. Ilara froze, her head tilted, the spoon suspended over the pot. Her heart, a usually dormant thing, gave a sudden, painful lurch. Such sounds were foreign here, in this forgotten corner of the world she had chosen as her refuge, or her prison. She placed the spoon carefully on the rough-hewn table, her movements deliberate, betraying none of the sudden tremor that ran through her. She reached for the old rifle propped near the door, its stock worn smooth by her father's hands, then hers. Its cold weight was a familiar reassurance. She did not expect trouble, not anymore. The world had largely forgotten her, as she had tried to forget it. But the prairie taught caution as its first, most vital lesson. Outside, the light was failing, the sky bruised purple and orange at the horizon. The wind whipped her skirts around her ankles, tugging at the stray wisps of hair that had escaped her severe bun. She scanned the bleak expanse, her gaze sharp, accustomed to deciphering the subtle language of the land. Then she saw it, a small, dark shape huddled near the creek bed, where the last of the autumn willows clung to life. Not an animal. Too still, too wrong. Her breath caught. She moved forward, the rifle held loosely at her side, her worn boots making little sound on the hard-packed earth. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself. A boy. No more than 7 winters, perhaps 8. His skin was the color of rich copper, his dark hair matted with dirt and something else, something terrifyingly dark. He was dressed in buckskin, torn and stained. A Comanche boy. Alone. And wounded. One leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, a shard of bone, white and stark, visible through a rip in his leggings. His eyes, when they flickered open, were wide with pain and a primal fear that mirrored the trapped rabbit she sometimes found in her snares. He tried to scramble away, a wounded animal sensing a predator, but a gasp of agony tore from his lips, and he collapsed back, his small body trembling. Ilara stopped. Her own pain, a dull, constant companion, resonated with the raw suffering before her. The rifle suddenly felt heavy, alien in her hands. She lowered it, propping it against a weathered fence post. This was not a threat. This was a child. The wind seemed to hold its breath, the silence pressing in, broken only by the boy's ragged breathing. She knelt slowly, her movements gentle, showing her empty hands. Easy, she murmured, her voice rough from disuse, softer than she intended. I won't hurt you. His eyes, dark as polished obsidian, never left hers, tracking her every move, expecting a blow, a betrayal. The air between them was thick with generations of mistrust, of fear. But in the face of his stark vulnerability, the ingrained suspicions of the frontier felt distant, unimportant. All she saw was a child, broken and terrified, far from his people, on the verge of succumbing to the cold indifference of the plains. She knew that indifference. It had been her unwanted bedfellow for too long. With a resolve that surprised even herself, she reached out, not to touch him, but to offer a silent promise. The decision, once made, settled in her like stone. She would not leave him to the wind and the wolves. The boy flinched violently when she first tried to lift him, a small, fierce sound escaping his lips, more animal than human. His small hands, surprisingly strong, pushed against her. "Shush," Alara soothed, her voice a low hum, the sound she once used for a fevered child of her own. "I mean no harm. You are hurt." Badly, she spoke slowly, the English words perhaps meaningless to him, but her tone, she hoped, would convey her intent. She tried again, moving with infinite care, supporting his injured leg, her touch firm but gentle. This time, he was too weak to resist, his small body surrendering with a shuddering sigh that might have been resignation, or simply the ebbing of his strength. He was lighter than she expected, a fragile burden against her chest. As she carried him towards the faint, welcoming glow of her cabin, the vast, empty prairie seemed to watch, its silence profound, holding a judgment she could not yet decipher. The wind rose again, swirling dust around them, as if trying to reclaim him, to pull him back into the wild. But Alara held on, her steps measured, her resolve hardening with each one. Inside, the firelight danced, casting long, flickering shadows. She laid him on her own narrow cot, the only soft place in the cabin, pushing aside the worn quilt her mother had stitched. His breathing was shallow, his skin clammy and cold. The wound on his leg was grievous, the blood already stiffening on his buckskins. She worked quickly, her hands, usually occupied with the rough tasks of survival, now moving with a forgotten tenderness. She stoked the fire, adding precious pieces of wood, then filled a basin with water, warming it by the hearth. He watched her through half-closed lids, his eyes filled with a stoic pain that tore at something deep within her. The fear was still there, a wild, trapped thing, but exhaustion was claiming him. She found her sharpest knife, sterilized it in the flames, then took a deep breath. She had set broken bones in animals, stitched gashes on her own skin. But this was different. This was a child. A life hanging by the thinnest of threads. She whispered to him, words of comfort, of reassurance, not knowing if he understood, but needing to fill the silence with something other than his labored breaths and her own hammering heart. The scent of blood, herbs, and wood smoke filled the small cabin, a primal aroma of crisis and care. The world outside, with its harsh winds and endless plains, ceased to exist. There was only the flickering firelight, the shallow breathing of the boy, and Alara, fighting a desperate battle against the encroaching darkness. She cleaned the wound, her touch as gentle as she could make it, ignoring his sharp intakes of breath, the tightening of his small fists. The bone needed setting. She found 2 flat pieces of wood, remnants of a broken crate, and strips of clean linen, torn from an old shift. As she worked, a single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek, a testament to the fragile humanity reawakening within her. He did not cry out, not once, though his body went rigid when she manipulated the fractured limb. A warrior's son, she thought, with a warrior's spirit. When it was done, his leg splinted and bandaged, she covered him with the quilt, tucking it gently around his small shoulders. His eyes were closed now, his face pale beneath its copper hue, but his breathing seemed a fraction easier. She wiped the sweat from his brow with a damp cloth, her fingers lingering for a moment on his smooth skin. A wave of profound weariness washed over her. She had done all she could. The rest was in hands other than hers. The silence returned, deeper now, punctuated by the soft crackle of the fire and the almost inaudible sighs of the sleeping child. Alara sank onto the hard wooden stool, her gaze fixed on the boy, a stranger who had, in a few short hours, shattered the careful defenses she had spent years constructing. The prairie night, cold and indifferent, wrapped itself around the small cabin, unaware of the fragile truce being brokered within. The night stretched, a black river flowing slowly towards an uncertain dawn. Alara did not sleep. She sat by the hearth, the fire casting dancing shadows that writhed like memories on the rough log walls. Each pop and hiss of the burning wood was a punctuation mark in the long, silent sentence of her vigil. The boy, Kai, as she had come to call him in the quiet of her own mind, for he needed a name, a human anchor in this sea of uncertainty, slept fitfully. Sometimes a soft moan would escape his lips, a fleeting shadow of pain crossing his young face, and Alara would lean closer, her hand hovering, wanting to offer comfort but hesitant to disturb his fragile rest. Her own past, a landscape she rarely revisited, rose unbidden. Images of another small face, pale with fever, another small hand clutching hers, flickered in the firelight. The loss had hollowed her out, leaving behind an ache that time had dulled but never erased. It was that ache, she realized, that had compelled her to bring the Comanche boy into her home. Not pity, not charity, but a profound, almost instinctual recognition of shared vulnerability, of life clinging precariously to existence. She had thought herself barren of such feelings, the well of her compassion long run dry. Yet, here it was, a hesitant spring bubbling up through parched earth. Outside, the wind whispered secrets through the chinks in the cabin walls, stories of the vast, untamed land, of ancient struggles and enduring spirits. It spoke of the boy's people, out there somewhere, searching, grieving perhaps. The thought brought a fresh pang of anxiety. What would they think, finding him here, in the home of a white woman? The history between their peoples was written in blood and mistrust. Her act of mercy could easily be misconstrued, her cabin seen not as a sanctuary, but a trap. As the first, faint hint of grey lightened the eastern sky, Kai stirred. His eyes fluttered open, dark and fathomless, fixing on her immediately. The fear was still there, a shadow in their depths, but it was overlaid now with a dawning awareness, a flicker of something akin to curiosity. He did not speak, made no sound, but simply watched her, his gaze intense, unnervingly perceptive for one so young. Ara rose slowly, her joints stiff from the long watch. She moved to the hearth, adding a few small pieces of wood to the glowing embers, the familiar ritual grounding her. She ladled some of the thin broth she had kept warm through the night into a small wooden bowl. It was mostly water and a few wild roots, but it was hot, and perhaps nourishing. She approached the cot, holding out the bowl. "For you," she said softly, her voice still raspy. "It is not much, but it will help." Kai stared at the bowl, then at her face, his eyes searching. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, slowly, hesitantly, he pushed himself up a little, wincing as his injured leg protested. He reached out a small, trembling hand, not for the bowl, but towards her. His fingers brushed her wrist, a touch so light it was like the landing of a moth. It was not a plea, nor a demand, but a simple, human contact, a fragile bridge across a vast divide. Ilara's breath hitched. She held still, allowing the contact, her own skin tingling at the unexpected touch. Then, as if satisfied by some unspoken test, he withdrew his hand and gestured weakly towards the bowl. She helped him sit up a little more, supporting his back with a rolled-up blanket. She held the bowl to his lips, and he drank, slowly at first, then with more urgency, the warm liquid seeming to revive him a little. A small trickle escaped the corner of his mouth, and she gently wiped it away with her thumb. He did not flinch. When he had finished, he sank back against the blanket, his eyelids drooping. A sigh, almost of contentment, escaped him. A fragile peace settled in the small cabin, as delicate as the morning light filtering through the single, grime-streaked window. The unspoken threat of what the day might bring still lingered, a cold draft beneath the door, but for now, in the quiet intimacy of the shared broth, a tiny seed of trust had taken root. Ara watched him drift back to sleep, a faint smile touching her lips, a smile so unfamiliar it felt like a stranger visiting her face. The rising sun cast long shadows across the prairie floor, painting the land in hues of gold and rose, a deceptive beauty that masked its underlying harshness. The silence of the morning was profound, a held breath before the world fully awoke. Ara knew the respite was temporary. The boy's presence was a secret she could not keep for long. Sooner or later, questions would be asked, if not by his people, then by the emptiness his absence created. She moved about her morning chores with a quiet urgency, her senses preternaturally alert. She checked the boy's bandages, relieved to find no fresh bleeding, no angry flush of fever. His breathing was deeper, more regular. He was holding on. She stepped outside, the cool morning air sharp against her face. The vastness of the prairie stretched in every direction, an endless canvas of muted greens and browns. The wind had died down, leaving an almost unnerving stillness. She carried a wooden bucket towards the creek, her gaze sweeping the horizon. Nothing. Only the distant shimmer of heat haze beginning to rise, the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. It was this deceptive calm, she knew, that often preceded the storm. She had just reached the creek's edge, the water gurgling softly over smooth stones, when she felt it, a tremor in the earth, a subtle vibration that hummed up through the soles of her worn boots. It was a sensation she knew, one that spoke of many hooves, moving at speed. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She straightened, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she always wore at her belt. Slowly, she turned, her eyes scanning the low rise to the west. And then she saw them. First one rider, silhouetted against the bright morning sky, then 2, then 10, then a score, until the entire ridgeline was dark with them. Warriors. Comanche. At least 80, she estimated, perhaps more, their ponies lean and fast, their movements fluid, a deadly, beautiful wave cresting the hill. They moved with a terrifying, silent purpose, their feathered lances catching the sunlight, their faces grim, unreadable from this distance. At their head rode a man taller than the rest, his presence commanding, his seat on his painted warhorse one of utter authority. Even from afar, Alara could feel the intensity of his focus, the coiled power he exuded. This had to be the boy's father. There was no other explanation for such a formidable force. They were not a hunting party. They were a war party or a rescue mission of overwhelming strength. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's carefully constructed composure. Her first instinct was to run, to barricade herself in the cabin, but she knew it would be futile. There was nowhere to hide, no defense against such numbers. She stood her ground, her feet rooted to the earth, the bucket forgotten in her hand. Her mind raced. Had they tracked the boy? Did they think her a captor? A killer? The implications were terrifying. The riders swept down from the rise, fanning out as they approached, their movements practiced, disciplined. They did not whoop or cry out, their silence more menacing than any war cry. Within moments, the cabin was surrounded, a ring of grim-faced warriors on alert ponies, their dark eyes fixed on her. The air crackled with unspoken threat, with the raw power of these men of the plains. Alara could smell the scent of horse sweat, of leather, of wood smoke clinging to their buckskins. It was the scent of a world utterly alien to her own, a world that was now, quite literally, on her doorstep. The leader reined in his horse a dozen paces from her, his mount, a magnificent animal, snorting and tossing its head. The man's face was stark, etched with lines of worry and hard living, his eyes like chips of flint, missing nothing. He was looking past her, towards the cabin. Towards his son. Alara's breath hitched. Kay. What would he do? What could she do? She forced herself to meet the leader's gaze, to hold it, though every instinct screamed at her to look away, to submit. She would not show fear. Not now. It was the only weapon she had left. The silence stretched, taut and brittle as old ice. The leader, his gaze unwavering, dismounted in a single, fluid motion. He handed the reins of his agitated pony to a warrior beside him, his movements economical, conveying an immense, contained strength. He was a man accustomed to command, his authority absolute, unspoken. His eyes, dark and piercing, swept over Alara, from the frayed hem of her dress to the anxious pulse beating at the base of her throat, which she tried desperately to still. He was reading her, she knew, like a hunter reads sign, searching for weakness, for deceit. He wore no paint, but a single eagle feather was tied in his long, black hair, a mark of distinction, of courage. His expression was unreadable, a mask of hardened resolve, yet beneath it, Alara sensed a father's desperate hope, a father's gnawing fear. He took a step towards her, then another, his moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth. Alara stood her ground, her hands held loosely at her sides, palms open, a gesture of non-aggression she hoped he would understand. She could feel the collective gaze of 80 warriors upon her, a physical weight, pressing, judging. The air was thick with the scent of horses and men, a primal, masculine energy that was both intimidating and strangely vital. She was an island, a solitary figure in a sea of potential hostility. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could see the intricate beadwork on his leather vest, the fine lines etched around his eyes. He was taller than she, and his shadow fell over her, a tangible presence. Still, he did not speak. The silence was a weapon, a test. Then, a small sound from the cabin doorway broke the spell. Kay. He stood framed in the opening, leaning heavily on the door jamb, his small face pale but resolute. He had dragged himself from the cot, his splintered leg awkward, his eyes wide as he took in the scene before him. He saw his father, and a look of profound relief, mixed with a child's fear of the overwhelming display of warrior strength, washed over his face. "Father!" The word was a cry, weak but clear, spoken in his own tongue. The leader's head snapped towards the sound. His stoic mask cracked, just for an instant, and a flicker of raw emotion, relief, anguish, love, crossed his features. He took a step towards the boy, then paused, his gaze returning to Alara, questioning, demanding. Kai, seeing the tension, the unspoken accusation in his father's eyes as they rested on Alara, did something unexpected. He pushed himself away from the door jamb and took a halting, painful step forward. He lifted his small hand, pointing not at Alara but at his own bandaged leg. Then, he looked at his father, his small face earnest, and spoke again, a rush of words in his native language. Alara could not understand the words, but his tone was clear. He was explaining, defending. He gestured towards the cabin's interior, then back to Alara, his small hand patting his own chest, then reaching out towards her in a mimicry of the gentle touch she had offered him. He was showing, not telling, the care he had received. The leader, Tavo, as she would later learn his name was, listened intently, his gaze shifting between his son and Alara. The warriors behind him remained still as statues, their eyes watchful, but a subtle shift occurred in their posture, a slight easing of the tension. Tavo's gaze on Alara softened fractionally. The flint in his eyes was still there, but perhaps a spark of something else, understanding, was beginning to glow. He looked at her simple, worn dress, her calloused hands, the worry etched on her face that mirrored his own. He saw not an enemy, but a woman, alone, who had harbored his lost son. He saw the worn quilt on the cot through the open door, the faint smell of herbs and broth that clung to the air. These were not the signs of a captor. He bent his head slightly, a gesture that might have been acknowledgement, or simply a moment of profound thought. The judgment was not yet complete, but the scales, Alara sensed, were beginning to tip. The fate of this fragile piece hung on the words, the actions, of a small, wounded boy and the silent testimony of a woman's unexpected kindness. The wind, which had been holding its breath, stirred again, whispering through the dry grass, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of a resolution yet to come. Tavo straightened, his gaze lingering on his son, a father's love, fierce and protective, evident in the slight softening of his jaw, the almost imperceptible easing of the harsh lines around his mouth. Then he looked back at Alara. The scrutiny was still intense, but the overt suspicion had receded, replaced by a deep, thoughtful appraisal. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the faint smudges of soot on her cheek, the way her hands, though steady, were clasped tightly before her. He saw the truth of his son's gestures, the unspoken story of care given in a place where none was expected. He took a slow breath, the air whistling softly through his nostrils. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the silent tableau. His warriors waited, their patience absolute, their loyalty to their leader unquestioning. They would follow his lead, whether it be to peace or to war. Kai, emboldened, took another painful step towards his father, then turned and gestured more insistently towards Alara, his small face pleading. He touched the crudely but effectively splintered leg again, then looked up at Tavo, his eyes shining with a child's simple faith in fairness. He spoke again, his voice a little stronger now, a short, emphatic phrase in his tongue. Alara could not understand the words, but the meaning was as clear as the prairie air. She helped me. Tavo's gaze fell to the boy's splintered leg. He was a warrior, a leader of warriors. He knew wounds. He could see the careful, if untutored, work that had been done. He could see the clean linen, torn from what was likely a precious garment. He saw the pallor of his son's face, but also the spark of life in his eyes, a spark that might have been extinguished had he been left alone on the prairie. He thought of the long, desperate night of searching, the fear that had clawed at his own heart, the image of his youngest son, lost, perhaps dead. And he saw this woman, this solitary settler, who had, for reasons he could not yet fathom, chosen compassion over fear, kindness over hostility. He looked around the meager homestead, the small, sturdy cabin, the patch of struggling garden, the vast emptiness that surrounded it. He understood solitude. He understood hardship. Perhaps he even understood the quiet strength it took to survive in such a place. He finally spoke. His voice was deep, like the rumble of distant thunder, gravel over velvet, as the old saying went. The words were in his own language, addressed to his son, but his eyes were on Alara. Kai listened, then nodded, a look of profound relief on his face. Tavo then turned his full attention to Alara. He raised his right hand, palm open, the universal gesture of peace. "Your heart," he said, his English heavily accented but understandable, the word seeming to cost him some effort, "is good." It was not an absolution, for she had committed no crime. It was an acknowledgement, a statement of fact, profound in its simplicity. He then gestured to one of his warriors, who dismounted and came forward, leading a pony. Not a warhorse, but a gentler mare, laden with what looked like bundled furs and provisions. The warrior stopped a respectful distance away. Tavo took another step towards Alara, his eyes holding hers. He reached into a pouch at his belt and drew something out. It was a single, perfect eagle feather, much like the one in his own hair, but smaller, more delicate. He held it out to her. "For the life of my son," he said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. "Our people do not forget a kindness." Or a debt. The tension that had held Alara rigid for what felt like an eternity finally began to ease. A shudder ran through her, a release of fear, of uncertainty. She reached out a trembling hand and accepted the feather, its delicate barb soft against her skin. It was more than a gift, it was a symbol, a covenant. A profound silence descended, no longer threatening, but filled with a quiet understanding that transcended language. Tavo turned to Kai, his stern features melting into an expression of pure, unadulterated love as he knelt before his son. He gently touched the boy's cheek, his large, weathered hand surprisingly tender. Words were exchanged between them, soft and low, the murmur of their language a soothing sound after the stark tension. Kai leaned into his father's embrace, all the fear and pain of his ordeal finally giving way to the security of his father's presence. The warriors watched, their faces stoic, but Alara sensed a collective exhalation of relief, a shared joy in the reunion of their leader and his child. Two warriors came forward carefully and, under Tavo's watchful eye, fashioned a makeshift litter, using blankets and two strong lances. They would carry Kai gently, protecting his injured leg. As they prepared to leave, Tavo approached Alara one last time. He did not offer more words, none were needed. Instead, he simply met her gaze, and in his dark eyes, she saw a depth of gratitude, a respect that warmed her more than the prairie sun. He inclined his head, a gesture of profound acknowledgement, a warrior's salute. Then, he mounted his warhorse, his movements once again fluid and powerful. With a silent command, the warriors wheeled their ponies, Kai carried carefully in their midst. The formidable war party, which had arrived with such menace, began to depart, not as an invading force, but as a grateful procession. They flowed back over the ridgeline, the thud of their ponies' hooves receding, until they were once again dark silhouettes against the bright sky, and then, they were gone. Alara stood alone, the eagle feather clutched in her hand, the silence of the prairie settling around her once more. But it was a different silence now. The emptiness did not feel so desolate, the solitude not so profound. She looked at the feather, its edges tipped with white, a symbol of courage, of spirit, of connection. A gift from a world she had thought forever closed to her. She went back into the cabin. The cot was empty, the small wooden bowl on the table. Traces of the boy's presence were everywhere, a slight indentation on the pillow, the faint scent of wood smoke and childhood that lingered in the air. Her own grief, the one that had been her constant shadow, felt lighter, as if a portion of its burden had been lifted and carried away by the departing riders. She had faced death many times, her own and others. She had faced loss and despair. But today, she had faced fear and chosen compassion. And in that choice, she had found an unexpected measure of peace, a fragile bridge not just to another people, but back to herself. The wind returned, whispering around the cabin, but its voice was different now, less a lament, more a gentle song. The prairie, vast and indifferent, still stretched before her, but it no longer seemed a prison. It was a place where even in the harshest landscape, the most unexpected acts of kindness could take root and, perhaps, even bloom. Elara held the feather to her heart, a silent promise to remember, to keep alive the fragile connection forged in a moment of shared humanity. The sun climbed towards its zenith, and the day, which had begun with such terror, now held the quiet glow of hope. The world, she realized, was perhaps a little wider, a little warmer, than she had allowed herself to believe. The days that followed settled back into their familiar rhythm, yet everything felt subtly altered. The silence of the cabin was still profound, but it no longer hummed with the low thrum of her own sorrow. Instead, it seemed to hold an echo of the boy's brief presence, the memory of his father's grave gratitude. Elara found herself looking towards the western ridgeline more often, not with apprehension, but with a strange sense of anticipation, though she knew they would not return. Their paths had crossed, a brief intersection of disparate lives, and now had diverged again. The eagle feather lay on the small, rough-hewn shelf above her hearth, its delicate beauty a stark contrast to the utilitarian objects that surrounded it, the chipped tin cup, the worn Bible, the small, carved wooden bird her own father had made her as a child. It was a constant reminder, a tangible piece of an encounter that had shifted something deep within her. The wound in her own heart, the one left by the loss of her child, had not miraculously healed, but it no longer felt like a gaping void. It was as if the simple act of caring for Kai, of pouring her long-damned maternal instincts into his small, broken body, had allowed a sliver of light into that dark space. She had given food, shelter, and rudimentary care to a wounded child, an enemy by the harsh codes of the frontier. And in return, she had received not violence, but a profound acknowledgement of shared humanity. The arrival of 80 warriors had been a moment of pure, undiluted terror, a terror that had stripped away all pretense, all her carefully constructed defenses. Yet, in that crucible of fear, something unexpected had been forged, respect, understanding, perhaps even a nascent form of peace. She thought of Tavo's eyes, flinty and hard, yet capable of such softness when they rested on his son. She thought of Kai's small, trusting hand, his courage in the face of pain. These were not the savages of settler nightmares, they were people, driven by the same fierce love, the same desperate fears, that motivated her own kind. The prairie itself seemed different. The wind still whispered, but now she imagined it carried different stories, not just of hardship and survival, but of connection, of bridges built across divides. The harsh landscape, once a reflection of her own internal desolation, now held a certain stark beauty, a resilience she was beginning to recognize in herself. She no longer felt quite so alone, so adrift. The encounter had tethered her, in some inexplicable way, not just to the land, but to the wider world of human experience, a world she had tried for so long to shut out. The memory of the warriors, their silent power, their ultimate restraint, filled her with a sense of awe. They had come expecting the worst, prepared for conflict, yet they had been willing to see beyond their assumptions, to recognize an act of kindness for what it was. It was a lesson in courage of a different kind, a moral courage that resonated deeply within her. The redemption she found was not a grand, dramatic affair, but a quiet, internal shift, a reawakening of empathy, a tentative step back towards the stream of life. Her cabin, once a fortress against grief, now felt more like a home, a place where a small measure of healing had occurred, not just for a wounded Comanche boy, but for the woman who had dared to help him. The simple gift of a feather had become a talisman, a symbol of a day when fear had given way to compassion, and 80 warriors on horseback had brought not destruction, but an unexpected, and profoundly moving, affirmation of human connection. Narrator, directly addressing the audience in a world so often fractured by fear and misunderstanding, where lines are drawn in the sand by mistrust and history, what does it truly take to bridge the divide? Can a single act of compassion, offered without expectation, ripple outwards to change hearts, to challenge ancient enmities? Elara offered succor to a child she was taught to fear. Tavo, a warrior chief, saw beyond the surface to the truth of her actions. Perhaps the greatest strength is not found in the force of 80 warriors, but in the quiet courage to see humanity in the face of the other. What lines in your own life could be redrawn by a simple act of understanding? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, please subscribe and click the notification bell for more tales that explore the depths of the human spirit. Until next time, look for the unexpected connections, for they are often where the truest stories reside.